Recently I discovered the joy of shooting wide, and I want to tell you about the lens that got me there. So last year DZO Film sent me their new 21mm Vespid Prime, and up until that point I'd never really shot with that focal length outside of maybe on a zoom lens. But because DZO Film sent me this lens to try out, I felt compelled to stick it on my camera and experiment with it. So this video is a little meditation on getting out of your comfort zone and a celebration of the art of shooting wide. But let me rewind a little. So like a lot of people, my route into filmmaking started with photography, and I think the 50mm was the first sort of prime lens I ever bought. And as a result, I got used to shooting with that lens and isolating my subject and throwing the whole background out of focus. And moving forward from that, that really influenced my style of image making. So as I got into filmmaking, I never really strayed away from that 50mm. Whenever I shot interviews, I'd chuck a fast 50mm prime on the camera. I've since built up a small collection of vintage 50mm lenses. And even more recently, when I got the DZO Vespid primes, I never really strayed away from that 50mm comfort zone. I would shoot either on a 35 or over to the 75. So last summer I shot a short doc with the 21mm and the 40mm, but that was using the Super 35 sensor of the Komodo. So again, I wasn't really straying too far out of my comfort zone. With the crop factor, we're probably looking at around 28, 29mm. But after that, I did start experimenting with the 21mm and adapted it with the speed booster, bringing it back to that sort of 21mm focal length. And I've been absolutely loving it. And I think that's because as soon as I started working with this lens, all the conventions and rules and things I was comfortable with went out of the window, and I had to pick up a whole new grammar of filmmaking and of shooting and of composition. And I really enjoyed that process because it suddenly stopped me being on autopilot. I soon realized that it was a really versatile lens. You can get some really great wide establishing shots of environments. You move closer to your subject and it's great for getting portraits and embedding people within sort of the context of their surroundings. It's great as a follow lens for documentary work. Perfect for following people and getting lots of creative movements in your frame. So I can really see why this lens would be favoured in fashion shoots where you're out and about on the streets and skateboarding videos. When you're shooting people, you do have to get quite up close to them, which might be intimidating if you're shooting documentary material. But I think this focal length really does something to embed the subject within their environment. You get much more context than shooting on a 50mm focal length. And sort of by getting up close to the subject, you can still really isolate them from their surroundings. If you've not got a lot of space to work with, shooting on a wide lens like this is really versatile. If you're in a small workshop or studio or office space, it really does feel like you're inviting the audience into the shot, and by moving your camera around, you can definitely increase or diminish the presence of your subject within the frame. The more I worked with this lens, the more I was reminded how much I love the work of Terrence Malick and the cinematographers he works with, Emanuel Lubezki and Jörg Widmer. The work from these cinematographers, I think, really embeds the audience within this raw sense of reality, which I guess blurs the boundaries between fiction and documentary. It sort of plays on the grammar of expectations that we have from documentary film where, stuff is shot a little wider, there's a lot more camera movement in it. It's sort of, I guess you would say, the antithesis of conventional Hollywood cinematography. Often that style of stuff relies on locked off, perfectly composed telephoto close-up shots, background compression. The subject is so isolated from the background that you don't really see any context of where they are. Because these filmmakers are shooting much wider, when they want to get closer to their subjects, they have to move the camera much closer. And that really heightens the sense of drama, and it creates this unique sense of depth within their frame. And, again, I think it sort of harks back to the sense of documentary filmmaking and that they often rely on camera movements to move between the wide and the close-ups. Instead of doing that through lens changes and editing, often they're shooting, on shoulder rigs or on Steadicams, and that camera movement becomes as much a part of the choreography of a scene as the movement of the actors. Now, I'm not obviously comparing myself to any of those amazing filmmakers, but I think what I'm trying to say is that since working with this 21mm and since playing around with it and experimenting with it, it's forced me to learn a new grammar of image making and new rules and conventions. I think if I've learned anything, it's the importance of getting outside of your comfort zone, playing around, experimenting. So in 2023, I'm really interested in shooting more at this focal length in my professional projects. So I'd also really love to try out the 16mm Vespid Prime, so I'm going to try and get my hands on that this year. So I'd be really interested to know if anyone else has got experience with it, what you think about it. As always, if you're not, please consider subscribing to the channel. I've got loads coming up in the next year, but until next time, see ya!